the utility, if you can put it that way, of torture than the head of Army Intelligence, who specialized, by the way, in interrogation. Certainly not some Air Force officer who's a desk jockey like General Hayden, who used to head the CIA until, well, still does until Tuesday, not a moment too soon. Okay, what else? Well, of course, we've already talked about torture being like rape and like slavery, just plain wrong. So where does that leave us? Well, I think that you have to sort of ask yourself, why do they do it? And before we do that, let me just add 2 or 3 more little things about why it's done. If you have a reputation on the battlefield of torture, nobody's going to let themselves be taken alive. They're going to discharge their last bullet. There's a true story of a situation at Iwo Jima, fierce fighting, where a Japanese prisoner, not prisoner yet, he was hiding in a cave. And when he heard the Americans go by, they had won the battle. He sheepishly came out of the cage, out of the cave, and sort of waved. And the sergeant said, "Should I shoot him?" And the lieutenant said, "No, we don't do that." Turned out this Japanese fellow spoke French. They got a French person to interrogate him, and turned out he was the code clerk for one of the leading Japanese generals. He was shipped immediately back to Washington, helped immensely in preventing further casualties and facilitating the end of the war. Now, if that Japanese who was hiding out in this cave, if he thought or he knew that the U.S. tortured or shot you on the spot, he wasn't going to do that. So that's just a convincing story that shows that there's a smarter way. The other 2 examples that are really telling have to do with Algiers and has to do with Iran. In both cases, Iran back in the late 50s, I'm sorry, Algiers back in the late 50s, early 60s, the French by virtue of torture won lots of battles, but they lost the war, didn't they? And we know, well, not many people do know this, when Khomeini came into Iran in '79, everybody said, "Wow, wasn't that clever? Wasn't that really clever?" Cassette tapes had just come out, and he was recording all these sermons, playing them from minarets, and he got all these people really interested. Man, that was just really clever. Well, it wasn't that, folks. It was partly that. But you know what it was? Every other family in Iran had somebody who had been tortured by Sabak, the secret police that we and the Israelis trained. It was a brutal regime, second to none in brutality that the Shah ran. And that comes home to roost. So why do they do it? Well, I'll be brief here. They do it not to get good information, but sometimes you need false information. Let me explain. You want to have a war? You want to accuse Saddam Hussein of being involved with Al-Qaeda? Well, get somebody to confess to that. As luck would have it, they wrapped up somebody who was in Al-Qaeda, a fairly high position. But he didn't know anything about Saddam Hussein training Al-Qaeda in things like chemical warfare or other techniques. So they sent them to the Egyptians. And they said, we think that he knows that Saddam was training this fellow, his name was Al-Libi, in these techniques. See if you can find out. And you know what? The Egyptians were able to get him to confess. And you know what? Our president, secretary of defense, vice president, bruited this out from the housetops in every major speech. We have this the president of the State of the Union address. We have this high-level defector, and that's what he said. Of course, until Al-Libi was released, and he recanted, he'd say, I only did it to stop the torture. So if you want false information, man, that's a really good way to get it, okay? Now, a couple other reasons, very briefly. If you want to intimidate people, like us, you don't have to be Al-Qaeda member, you can just be an enemy combatant. And the president, as the law now stands, can come up and take David and Ann and me and carries off to some brig in South Carolina, you may never hear her again. That's the truth, folks. That's what the law would permit. So there's an intimidation effect there that they strive after. Another thing is just because we torture, because we can. Yeah? We're a pretty powerful nation, and just don't mess around with us, you know? Don't screw with the Jews, is what somebody says now about Gaza. Well, don't screw with the United States, because we are the sole remaining superpower in the world, or were until this year or last. And finally, you know, it's racism, folks. It's racism. Why is it that Attorney General Mukasey and National Intelligence Director Mike McConnell can say quite out loud, it would be torture if it happened to me. Waterboarding would be torture if it happened to me. Well, why isn't it torture if it happens to people who are darker in skin, or who have a rag on their head, or whatever, you know? It's racism, and that's really pernicious. That's my view, at least. So, what we do? Well, we ask why these politicians allow it. And the reason they allow it is because they're all complicit. Because they were told about the torture. And I'm talking about Nancy Pelosi, I'm talking about Jay Rockefeller, I'm talking about people like that. They were told about the torture, and they didn't do anything to stop it. As a matter of fact, the word is that they cheered about it. They thought, oh yeah, it's a great thing, you know? And let's say Nancy Pelosi wants to say now that she was against it, and she reveals that she's going to do that. What happens to her? She's visited by the FBI or Homeland Security, and they say, well, Nancy, you know, it's really not an option now. She said, why not? Well, you've heard of this illegal eavesdropping. Well, you know, we got you on tape, you know, so. That's how bad it is, folks, and that's exactly why the FISA law was written. That's what J. Edgar Hoover used to do all the time. So it's a kind of a convoluted nexus of deception, law breaking, and everything. And our elected representatives are not going to stop it. And so what's going to stop it? We're going to stop it. And we just have to really make sure that President Obama, come Tuesday, realizes that we're not going to settle for torture light. We're not going to settle for little exceptions here and there. We're going to insist on the application of the Army manual, and the Army knows what it's doing, folks. You know, the Army is not going to be soft on terrorists, okay? And that's what's bothering these politicians. So I've carried on too long here, but let's remember, this is a moral issue. It's a utilitarian issue. There are so many reasons against this that if it were not for all the other idiotic things that this administration has done, it would be hard to believe that they started to engage in torture. Thank you very much.
You've been wanting to say this
That's
for
right.
a long time.
Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock the bastards up and throw the key away. Far away! A few years down and get mowed, and life in Abu Ghraib. Make sure their sorry asses never see the light of day. Think you got it? 2, 3, 4. Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock the bastards up and throw the key away. Far away.